Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of Ancient Office Hours. Who else is excited that Halloween is coming up in 4 days? This episode feels very appropriate to release because Dr. Young Richard Kim of the University of Illinois at Chicago and I were able to chat about a few traditionally taboo topics that, to some, may seem kind of spooky. I am also very proud of this episode because this is the first, and hopefully not the last, conversation I was able to share with another Asian American in classics. We chatted about the dignity of work, the intersection of personal religion and the academic study of ancient religion, the experience of being an Asian in classics, and dropped some scorching hot takes on how to change the way we teach U.S. and ancient world history in high schools. I hope you enjoy this episode and have a very safe and happy Halloween weekend. Thank you for joining me this bright and early, beautifully, wonderfully, mercifully cool day, because I woke up and it was beautifully like 69 degrees and I was so happy because I hate the heat. Weather aside, I want to just jump right in and ask you, how did you find your way into classics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the journey actually began for me, like a lot of people, in elementary school with the first exposure to Greek mythology. When I was in fourth grade, and this is going to probably disclose a little bit the age in which I grew up, but each week our teacher would play these cassette tapes and we would have these book with mythological stories in them. And so we would listen to this narrator, with a little bit of sound effects, basically read adapted versions of Greek myths. And, of course, stories of gods and heroes and fantastic monsters and this kind of thing. That really piqued my curiosity at a young age for Greek mythology. And from that point forward, I think it really just kind of built over the years. And it's going to sound a little odd, but I've always been more skilled at languages and social studies and English versus math and science. And so even in high school, I really gravitated toward those kinds of subjects. And so I knew that once I went to college that I wanted to continue studying. For me in particular, it was history. Ancient history was what really got me. So that's what got me started. And of course, all throughout undergraduate, I studied classics and I studied history. And then I went on to get a graduate degree in ancient history.
Yeah, well, I sympathize with you on the math and science thing because I am so terrible at both. I just hated both subjects. I never wanted to take the classes.
Yeah.
I knew history, and I knew that was my jam
So,
pretty much my whole life.
I have the additional burden of being a son of a PhD in mathematics. My father has a doctorate in math, and so I think I was always a bit of a disappointment when it came to that subject. I mean, I did calculus and stuff, but it just never clicked for me. So I knew that my destiny was not in anything really numerical.
That may be some added pressure. Oh man, I feel lucky because I escaped that because I was adopted from China by, luckily, my wonderful Caucasian family. So there was like none of that Asian pressure to, you must succeed, you must do math, and you must be brilliant, and then you must go solve cancer or, change the world, go to outer space. And so I was almost like allowed this freedom to be a little more impractical because my parents always, they were like, oh, well, she's just gonna creative and numbers, that's not her thing, whatever. She can do a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of running around and pretending, like there was a lot of costume wearing when I was younger, a lot of running around my backyard, pretending that I was some great mythological hero. So I definitely get you got onto it early. Although for me, it was 6th grade, not 4th grade. So I'm a little surprised, for some context.
Yeah.
Where did you grow up? Because I don't know if it's like a staple of the Illinois Chicago system, but most of my friends growing up here, we didn't do any kind of mythology or even ancient history until at least fifth, but usually sixth grade.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Southern California in Orange County. So I have no idea what the curriculum is like nowadays. But certainly when I was in elementary school, this is in the 80s, we did have mythology. In fact, I remember our teacher even gave us some lessons in art history. So it was really cool, because we got exposed to some things that we might not otherwise have been, especially in the kind of testing heavy curricula that really dominate primary education now. So yeah, we were able to do some interesting things and creative things and explore subjects that I think that were great for all of us, because any kind of exposure to the different sort of traditions of the past, I think are good for students.
For sure. I know you just mentioned that your dad has his doctorate in mathematics, and so obviously very math oriented. But from your own personal like family history, since I know for a lot of Asian cultures, like holding on to tradition in the past is very important. Was there any sort of exposure to Asian mythology when you were younger?
Yeah, definitely. Because I remember my mom bought. There were these Korean children's books, and they included this series that she bought was basically like 20 volumes of stories from the Korean mythological tradition, and they were in Korean. So that was, of course, a challenge because my mom was trying to teach me to read Korean. Maybe come to think of it, it might have been bilingual on one side. Korean, and on the other side English, like a lobe of Korean mythology. But it was great because I learned some of these stories. And so I remember like one story of a man who was cursed with this kind of lump that was hanging from the side of his face. And I think he made a deal with some kind of a goblin and ultimately wanted to have that lump attached to someone that he was a rival with. And then what ended up happening is he ended up getting 2 lumps. And, so there's a moral at the story, like if you treat your enemies badly, then, it's going to come back and bite you. And so there were definitely some Korean traditional folk tales, as we would call them, that I learned as a kid. I guess I must have resisted them a little bit as well, because my mom was like trying to get me to read Korean and I didn't want to. And of course, in retrospect, I regret that. I wish I had really spent the time to learn to read it well. So I think that's, and my parents, because they were immigrants from Korea, we really grew up in a household that clung to our Korean culture. So the foods that we ate, the languages that my parents spoke to us in Korean. There were a lot of little things about my upbringing as well as my siblings that were very traditionally Korean, which I think in again looking back on that is absolutely a part of who I am now, an important part of that.
Yeah, and we make such a big deal about this weird juxtaposition, right, of East versus West, and in almost every aspect that we can find in the US, at least, it's pitting East and West, which I don't really understand why we need to do that in the first place, but I digress. But when you knew math wasn't your thing and you're like, okay, I like this history thing, I like this mythology thing, was there at any pushback from your family when you were like, oh, I like this Greek stuff, I like this, bedrock of Western civilization? And was your family at any point just like, but we're Asian, we're from the East, so why aren't you doing Asian mythology as a career?
No, my parents were very supportive, which I think, again, I know a lot of others have had epic clashes with their folks about, pursuing anything that's not either practical or, able to generate financial security. I understand that. But my parents were actually quite supportive. And it was a struggle, right? Because I think especially in primary and secondary school, you still have to perform well in order to get into college, right? And so I still had to study math and do well in it, or as well as I could, as well as science. And I was okay, I did fine. But my grades were always stronger in the humanities. So I think my parents realized it. And then I think maybe the kicker was back when I took the SAT, this is in the, well, gosh, it'd be the 90s now, early 90s, there was only a verbal and a math score. And, my verbal score was higher than my math score, in the end. And so I think at that point, maybe my parents finally realized, okay, this person is not going to be the math, the wizard, that his father was. And so, or is, maybe there was a sense of resignation, but once they realized that, then they really kind of freed me to pursue whatever I wanted to in college. And so that was great, and I knew I wanted to study history and classics. And so they were very generous in their support. So I think that really helped, because I know for a lot of others, who don't get that, then it becomes this kind of epic struggle and a kind of clash of identity too.
Yeah, I met more than one person in my department at Mizzou who they told me it was like battle royale every time on the phone with their parents. Okay, have you switched your major to something that'll actually bring you happiness, money,
Right.
successful career? And they would be like, no, still
Yeah.
here, still toiling away.
Yeah,
But
and having been in higher ed now for a long time, there is a stereotype, right, that if you study philosophy or art history, or actually produce art, that you are going to starve, right, or have a really hard time. But I think that's problematic narrative, because especially like students who study philosophy and have really great analytical ability and the ability to articulate arguments, they end up in a variety of different kinds of jobs and professions. And so that's something I try to teach my students too, is that an education that's well grounded in the humanities or broadly in the liberal arts, that actually opens a lot of different doors, and employers are looking for people who can think and read and make an argument. It's not like when you come out of college as a chemistry major that you're a chemist, right? I mean, there's additional training that comes in whatever profession you ended up going to. And so the humanities really creates a kind of well-rounded person. And I think, majoring in any of those fields or double majoring, I think that's a great thing. But I know there's a lot of parents who say, no, you must major in business or else, that kind of a thing.
I've met too many unfortunate people in college who felt trapped. And so every day they would kind of look a little miserable.
Yeah.
Because you'd go, hey, you all right there? And they'd go, I'm fine. I just have this business thing or an accounting class that I really don't want to go to. And I remember it was never starker than when we would compare schedules.
Mm-hmm.
And when you would, try to sync up your schedule so you could hang out with somebody. So you're like, okay, so what's your class schedule like? Do you have a break when I have a break? And so when people would see my classes, which I piled on just classics, class after classics, and then some art history in there and all these fun classes. And then I would see my friend's schedule, which was like business and accounting and then, meteorology. And they just look at my schedule and go, well, where are those classes? How did I not, can I take these? Or even if they could take them, I can only take one. That's not fair. And I was like, well, man, just switch your major to classics. Then you can have a schedule just like mine. And, and then you get the fun. Oh, never going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if every student could actually study exactly what they're passionate or interested in,
Wouldn't that be so revolutionary?
It would, wouldn't it? And I think there'd be so many more happy people. But, and I know that the cost of higher ed is obviously a concern, and especially for parents. And so, there's this sense in which if a parent or parents are going to make an investment, they want to make sure that when their children come out of their undergraduate, that there's going to be a payoff, so to speak, right? But I think if we could change that story a bit, that would really, I think it would make our society a happier society. But
I think it's a bad investment to send kids off to this environment where they're supposed to be able to discover themselves and what makes them happy, to send them off with this like mission that they know makes them miserable. I'm like, that's a terrible investment, because you want a bunch of kids who go to all these classes and get the degree, but come out kind of like zombies, a little dead inside, a little dead looking on the outside because they're so miserable with what they had to do. But if we allowed all kids to just go to college and do exactly whatever it is they want to do, I think there's this like false dichotomy of, well, it doesn't matter, just take the punches, but you'll get the good major that makes you money, and then the money will bring you happiness. And I'm like, no, it should be the other way around. You should be happy doing what you love in college, because if you can be happy doing whatever it is, you will just be happy. Like, I don't know a single person who is doing something they love, but then is sitting here like, I regret everything because I'm not making the 6, 7, 8 figure paycheck. Oh, I'm so miserable. I'm like, no, everyone I know is like, yeah, okay, maybe I struggle a little to pay the bill, but as long as I get paid and I'm doing what I love, I'm fine.
Yeah, and I also think that, like, I wish we would have a different perspective, for example, on community colleges, right? Because these are wonderful resources that, again, this kind of pathway of graduate high school, then go to a 4-year university, even that is not for everyone. And so I think people should have the chance to maybe take time off, go to a community college and take some courses to see, what would be the right path to pursue. Especially like when I was growing up, it would have been unheard of for me or anyone in my generation, the children of immigrants from Korea, to like opt to go to a community college. That would just be non-acceptable. There are wonderful teachers and great courses in community colleges, and I think that's a resource that is unfortunately in this country undersourced. That we really could do a lot more with that. And I would advocate for having it free. If like our public education system. I mean, if we could make community college and if we could make that free, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that's a real hot take right there.
It
shouldn't be, but it is a hot take, which I completely agree with. I was just about to say, I think we should make them free, because then you can also say, okay, well, even if you don't know if 4-year degree at a university is for you, here's your like testing phase, here's your starter phase, right? You can go, you kind of be experimental, see if this college thing is for you, and then it's like, okay, do 2 years at a free community college, and you're like, oh, this college thing is for me. Then you can transfer into whatever. I think that would just produce a lot more faith in the system, in the college system. I mean, we're just so cynical, and people who don't get the chance to go to college or who don't want to, they get very cynical about it, because it just seems like it's laid out as a very structured thing, which it really shouldn't be. I don't think enough people understand college really is a sort of fluid thing. I don't know. It's kind of like trade school, right? I know too many people who don't want to go to trade school but do want to go to trade school, but they're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm like, I don't know. There should be a period where you can try out trade school.
Yeah.
For a free year or something, and be like, okay, is this for me, or should I go, do more book learning?
Right. And I think that's another, this is kind of a bigger question, but like the dignity of work, right? I mean, whatever work a person does, that's something that is part of a person's identity and a sense of being. And I hope that we could become a society that, whether you're a professor or if you're a plumber, it doesn't matter. Those are respective crafts and traditions and skills that I can't do the work of an electrician, for example, but I have great respect for electricians because they're trained in their craft and they can do it well. And so I wish we would have this broader sense of like everyone's work is something that is worthy. But there's a lot of arguments, I suppose, to be made.
But it resonates. As someone who started her career in politics, I went right out to DC, did the cliche intern on Capitol Hill thing, but I learned so much. And one of my favorite contemporary politicians is actually Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio. And he had this whole sort of working tour that he did going around the state of Ohio. And he called the tour The Dignity of Work. And it's because it resonates. And his whole message is, in this society where we prize education level and, how educated can you be? How can you one up the next person in the room? And that leads to all this resentment and this stigma and this whole, oh, well, I don't have a college degree. Oh, well, you have a PhD. Well, then you must think that I'm just this little person and I don't matter. It's very interesting that you mentioned the dignity of work, because I was just thinking about, I was in a conversation about this the other day with somebody, and I was thinking, to go back to your electrician example, do I look down because they went to trade school and learned to be an electrician? Heck no, because guess what? I would electrocute myself and I would die if I tried to do anything electrical. My Wi-Fi breaks, my TV, my anything breaks. Oh yeah. Or, if my toilet breaks and we don't have plumbers, it's literally going to explode in my face.
I agree. And unfortunately in our country, wages are too low. Healthcare is too expensive, so if we could fix some of these societal ills, we could be in a different place and really think differently about work. But unfortunately, there are forces that go against that, and so, I mean, I wish we could become different, and maybe we will.
Yeah, for sure. So getting, that was a fantastic tangent to go off on, but getting a little back to when you're in college. So I had supportive parents as well who just told me, whatever you want to do, whatever you like, do it. So I definitely didn't have any pushback from them when I was like, I want to be a classics major and study the bedrock of civilization, yada, yada, yada. But did you encounter any sort of personal pushback where you're kind of sitting there at any point and then you suddenly think to yourself, maybe this isn't the greatest idea because this seems like a really hard thing, and then you have all the languages piled on there, and then all these restrictive forms of gatekeeping to even get into classics. Did you just kind of sit down at any point, maybe junior year, even senior year, when you're like about to graduate, and then you're like, actually this is looking a little harder?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess during my undergraduate studies, I never felt that. And in fact, like I loved what I was doing, especially when it comes to languages. I really enjoy studying and communicating and speaking in other languages. And so I knew once I had decided I was going to go to graduate school in ancient studies, classics, whatever, I knew that languages were kind of one of the tools that I needed to succeed. And so, by my junior and senior year, I took a fifth year too. I was basically just taking classes in Greek, Latin, German, and French, and just studying languages. And I realized too that I was quite privileged to be able to do that, right? Because I had supportive parents, I had the financial means to do this, and so I recognized that. So I didn't feel that gatekeeping. Although I'll tell you, like where I did have this moment where I was teetering between doing something else so I applied to graduate school twice. The first time I applied, I took the GRE. It was the computer adapted version. So it was like this version, and maybe it still is now, where you have to take the GRE on a screen. And so I took that test and I bombed it. And so I had a really horrible GRE score. And so I applied to graduate schools, just 4 schools that first time. And because I had such a horrible GRE score, I only got into 1 school with partial funding, which was, I guess, a miracle in and of itself. And so this stupid exam, the standardized test, was a kind of barrier to my going to graduate school. And so at that point, I was talking to my dad and I was like, maybe this isn't the right path for me. I obviously couldn't hack it on this test. And he kind of metaphorically slapped me upside the head and said, study for it and do it again. And that's why I took a 5th year. I delayed graduating to take some more classes, but then also to take the GRE again. And so I took the GRE, this time in the paper and pencil format, which was what I was already accustomed to. And then, by the way, that speaks to standardized tests don't actually test your aptitude or your intelligence or anything like that. It just tests like whether or not the test taking gimmicks and the algorithms and that kind of thing. And so when I took the written version versus the computer adapted version, I did really well. Then I applied more widely. I applied to like 10 schools. I got into half of them, got full funding packages from 2 of them. And so I actually had, again, the luxury and the privilege of choice of where to go to graduate school. But I almost gave it up because of this stupid test. And so in that way, it wasn't the field itself that functioned as the kind of gatekeeper that might have kept me out, but it was kind of the apparatus of graduate school and the GRE exam. I don't know if that's what you've heard from other people, but that was the point that actually I had thought, okay, this is not for me. And fortunately, my dad's wisdom kind of prevailed, and I tried again, and I put my mind to it, and I was able to go to grad school without accruing debt. So that was a real blessing and a privilege. So.
Well, obviously you made it and you got the PhD, got the shiny degree that says, hey, I'm smart about this really like exclusive thing. Woohoo. So turning a little to your research though, what was it about Byzantine period? Because obviously I think most people, when they think of classics, they get this idea that, okay, classics is just the 4th and 5th century BC, or it's just Bronze Age collapse, or we like pigeonhole classics into these short periods, relatively short periods of time. And we just think, okay, well, it only encapsulates this. Was that you loved the Byzantine period because the period spoke for itself, or was it a little bit of that sort of rebellious, well, I don't want to just study what everyone else is doing. That's boring. I'm going to pick something a little obscure, but also that interests me, and I'm going to do that.
These are great questions. So when I was an undergrad, I went to UCLA for undergraduate. So, as I was taking classics courses and Greek and Latin courses, I was reading. I remember I took a course in Thucydides. I read a course in Plato and Aristophanes and in Cicero and Virgil. So I was reading all of the texts that we think of when we think of classics, right? The canon, so to speak. There was a history course that I took with a professor by the name of Claudia Rapp, and she taught basically a course in late antiquity. And so late antiquity is this interesting period in ancient studies that is sort of in between spaces. So late antiquity, sometimes we think of it as as the name implies, a part of the ancient, right? So it's looking back to the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans, and whether it's maintaining a sense of continuity or a break from that, its kind of field's relative position is looking backward. But on the other hand, late antiquity is also a kind of a forward-looking field in time, and depending on what area you're in geographically, we might be entering into what scholars have called the Byzantine Empire. Or if you're looking more westerly, then maybe we're entering in what scholars have called the early medieval. And again, that shows you this is all kind of all made up anyway, right? These are periodizations and categorizations that scholars have decided to help us organize our knowledge. But for me, late antiquity was such a fascinating period. And so what really got me excited about doing graduate work in late antiquity was, taking this course with Claudia Rapp. And then in particular, I was really interested in Constantine, this emperor, the first Christian emperor, interested in the Council of Nicaea, this event that changed the course of history, right? But so my interest in for graduate work was in late antiquity, and that spills naturally over then into what we call the Byzantine Empire, right? And the Byzantine Empire really is the Roman Empire, just continuing on in the East. Yeah, for one, I think we should have a much more expansive view of the classics, right? And classics really isn't just about Greece and Rome either, right? Because if we're looking at the Mediterranean, it's such a diverse and multilingual and multicultural world that has so many different kinds of peoples and traditions and institutions. And so I like to have this expansive view geographically, but also chronologically, right? I mean, the ancient world or its, legacy and its continuity, I think a big kind of picture is very exciting for me to study, because having a good foundation in what we kind of call the classics and the canon authors, that enables me then to look at these later periods and read authors who were also reading those same texts, and then to be able to make these kinds of connections. And for me, that's what's really exciting about late antiquity and early Byzantium.
Yeah. So I love how you mentioned Constantine and this idea he's the first Christian emperor. He's the first one that they got. They got this pagan and they were like, aha, no more, pagan, no more. And he's really changing stuff now. This kind of stems from almost something coming right out of my personal life and background. So I'll quickly just give everyone a little background on it. My best friend from college, my roommate, lived with her. She is doing a master's in theology at Notre Dame. And she's really interested in like the history of Catholicism, Christianity, all that stuff, kind of past to present. So now that you mention Constantine, it just occurred to me, we were having a conversation the other day about how it was shocking to her to find out that many scholars of history, many classicists, in fact, study the religious aspects of the ancient world from a non-religious perspective. Like, it didn't occur to her that you could be an atheist and deeply study the religious parts of the past. From this conversation that's been circulating in my mind, I kind of have a two-parter for you. One, did you grow up religious? And two, do you think it's an advantage to be religious and study ancient religion, or is it an advantage to be more atheistic or fluid or secular and then study ancient religion?
Yeah, wow. These are great questions. I mean, so, I grew up, my parents became Christians when I was in elementary school, and I became a Christian when I was in high school, and I still am. And so I have a faith commitment. At the same time, I'm also trained as a classicist and ancient historian, right? So, one of the things I learned in graduate school, and this is a really important thing for the process for me, is that grow up in a religious tradition, you learn a narrative of the history of Christianity, in my case, that in retrospect is quite simplistic, right? And this is something that I teach my students too, right? There's one narrative that says that, Jesus taught his disciples a theology, right? Or a theology about him. And then those disciples understood it exactly as Jesus taught it, and they all agreed. And then all of those first disciples then taught the next generation. And then the next generation accepted it, received it, and understood it in the exact same way. And so it's almost like this kind of unbroken line, what now, what we would say is like the corrective belief or the orthodox belief. And that somehow each time it's passed down generation after generation, it remains like pristine and intact, right? But having studied now the history of Christianity, and this is actually what my early research, the early part of my career was dedicated to studying this particular development, Christian belief and practices and its transmission, it's so messy. From the very beginning to that first generation, like the earliest followers of Jesus, the earliest Christians, there was so much disagreement even among them. This rosy picture of everything kind of being passed down, unbroken, I think that's overly simplistic. And in fact, it's really, really messy and complicated and political and sometimes violent, but that's a process that works itself out. Now, as a historian, as someone who studied this, I look at these developments through those lenses. But does that necessarily mean then that on my kind of personal faith commitment that I say, oh, I'm just going to toss it all out now? That's not me. That's not how it applies to me. And in fact, for me, those complexities and those tensions and those uncertainties kind of enhance my own personal faith, right? But here's the other thing too, is that no one does what we do as historians or classicists without their own respective, depending on what word you want to use, baggage or lenses or biases or whatever. Everyone comes to our respective subjects with some kind of angle. So even if we're reading Virgil, the Aeneid, how we mechanically translate the words from Latin to English is one process. And there's all sorts of biases that go into that. But then how we actually interpret those texts, either the translation or what we say about them, we all come with different things, right? And different lenses. And so I think we need to be honest with that. And I think that's really something that, again, in our American kind of culture today, it's a real problem when people say there's only one right storyline or version or narrative. Now, you can go off the rails, and a lot of people do, right? And the sources and the methods, some people, twist and turn and manipulate and do that. And I think that's a problem. But on the other hand, this idea that there's like objectivity, right? That very word itself is really problematic, right? Because no matter what, there's always some angle that we're coming with. There's something that we bring to the table. I think the best scholarship and the best kind of community that we form is when we're honest about that and then we converse about that. There are going to certainly be points where we disagree. So Constantine is like a classic example. There's so many different interpretations of this dude, right? Some say he was a religious zealot. Others would say the complete opposite, that the guy was just purely political and his conversion was just a move to garner supporters and power. And then there's all sorts of arguments in between. The work that we do as historians and classicists and scholars and students is exploring those in-between spaces, right? And coming up with the different arguments and interpretations, right? So, an example like him should help us realize that Constantine, this really important historical figure, there are lots of different ways to interpret this guy, some that seem to be mutually exclusive, but that's how history works, right? I mean, we're interpreting sources and what's available to us. We obviously can't talk to him, and so we're doing our best to try to understand him, but we could come up with some very different answers. And so that just shows you then that this whole process, this whole interpretive work that we do, there's room for that. So then for your friend who studies theology, sometimes theologians and philosophers do this too. Sometimes there's this idea that kind of like the theology kind of plops down from heaven. And then our job is to kind of figure out what came to us from heaven. And then, and then to be able to write about that and to write books. And it's a process. And the humans are involved in this process. And so it's a lot messier than I think sometimes, especially when I was younger, I was led to believe. But for me, that realization is a great realization.
I think it's really interesting, but also I think it speaks a little to the heart of what I've been noticing in the past 3-4 years, which is most people who I have met or interacted with or just know personally who study any aspect of ancient religion, whether it's from the classical lens of ancient Greek religion or Byzantine religion, or even down to Mesopotamian and Egyptian religion. I think there's this idea that if you're going to go into religious studies or the religious studies department or whatever you want to call it, there's been a lot of like preconceived biases against, oh, well, you wouldn't go into ancient religion unless you're religious yourself. Like, why on earth would you put yourself through that if you don't care? For all these people out here who, like myself, my entire family's Jewish, but I would say I personally grew up pretty secularly, and then as an adult I kind of just drifted off into the more, first I hit agnosticism, and then I just, at this point I'm probably closer to an atheist. I don't really know. It doesn't really matter to me. But when I talk about wanting to study ancient religion, or if I tell someone that I have an interest in this, either get, oh, that's so interesting, you're going to bring your secular brain to it, and then you're going to help from a non-background religious bias, you're not going to let it seep into your analysis of things. And then other people, they just go, oh, so you must be very deeply, deeply religious. Like, what can we do to stop this weird stigma of either you're super religious if that's what you want to study versus, oh, okay, we'll just go and make it more, secularize it if you're not. Like, how do we stop that?
Yeah, I think one thing is like, we got to get rid of that dichotomy. It's like one or the other, the binary, right? And again, like for me, as I've been sort of sharing with you, like the in-between space is really, I think, where most of us are. You know, let's say you want to do something religious studies oriented. You can come to religious studies with a faith commitment. You need to be honest about that, right? And that those particular commitments might affect and inform how you read things and how you interpret things. But the same applies to someone who has zero commitments or who's an atheist, right? Like that person also brings to the table some assumptions and some maybe priorities. But again, like it's not either or. It's like it's not you're either have to be like fully religious or atheist. And depending on which of those two you choose, then how you come to religious studies or theology, you know, you're going to have these vastly different results. I think, you know, we need to be honest with ourselves, but then figure out how, like sometimes like Constantine again comes up, right? So someone who's very cynical about religion cannot look at Constantine and say, oh, this guy actually believed, like he actually had a religious experience and then became a Christian, right? And that inability to even recognize that as a possibility, that really pigeonholes the interpretation that's available, right? If you can only see this as a cynical or political move, then that's the only result you're going to come up with, right? On the other hand, the person who might be deeply religious and a Christian says Constantine, you know, God gave him these visions that led to his conversion. Maybe that person is unable to think, oh, there's actually some political advantage to be gained by this, right? And so again, those extremes, they don't actually produce a conversation and a debate. That I think is what we want to be doing, is saying, oh, what if there are different combinations of these different possibilities? A genuine religious experience, politically motivated, advantageous, sure, why not? You know, doesn't that make Constantine seem actually more human? You know, and so I think that's part of the thing too, is that we need to be honest about our humanness as we put forth our explanations of why things happen the way they do.
And I think a lot of that is a byproduct of a lot of people. They like to frame history in that, you know, it's so long ago, so we have this sort of bird's eye view where we can go and see all these ancient peoples and ooh, what decisions did they make? One thing that I always kind of maintain is they are still just an older version of us. And the moment that you start treating these historical figures as anything other than just super ancient humans like us who had similar, not obviously the same because technology, but similar issues, human issues, then I'm like, you've lost the point of studying history if it's not deeply emotional study of what it meant to be a human just in the past.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
It's just interesting to me when I hear fellow historians sometimes just be like, oh, well, we would never do something that's silly. That's stupid. I mean, why would they do that? And I'm like, because they're human, because I'm human. My situation might not look like theirs, but if I was in that situation, hey, maybe I would do the same thing.
Yeah. And so that's the beauty of the humanities, right? The disciplines of the humanities. Not only are we exploring contemporaneously, like the differences between you and I, even, or the countries that are part of this world that we live in, but we're also chronologically also looking at the shared experience of humanity, right? And I think that's a really good point, right? So sometimes we think of Constantine as almost like a otherworldly figure, right? He was a human, he was a dude. And so whatever issues that, not the same, but there are going to be these things about our humanity that we have in common. Exploring our subjects in that way, I think, is what makes the humanities such an important part of an education. Is we study these different people and these traditions to understand each other and to understand ourselves.
Yeah, you and I know we could wax eloquently about the inherent value of the humanities. To, as historians, we can literally take what we study and say, look, this is so relevant to today. This is essentially, yes, we study these people, but these were the contemporary issues of their time. So, take, cut, paste, and sort of change things. But look, it's they mirror each other. We know that. I think it's definitely nice to have that affirmed, but also hopefully to show other people when they think of it as, no, this is just this ancient thing, 10,000 years ago. We just talk about these in theoretical long terms. We have no concept of what a long time is. I mean, we live in a country that's around 250 years old. We have no idea what ancient really is. Just you bandy these numbers about and you're like, okay, well, that's really, really old. That's what I can say about it. So
no, and I'm so I never tell my students history repeats itself. I think that's a bad way of thinking about history, right? Because every context, every situation, every time, every culture, every people is different. So I don't want students to walk away from my courses thinking, oh, this is just the same thing that happened 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and it's just happening again, right? But rather, I want them to understand there are things about humans that are consistent, right? And so we can identify what those kinds of things are. And then I think we can talk about our contemporary experience and the things that are going on in our world, knowing that humans behave pretty similarly, but that doesn't mean that, X event or Y event from antiquity is the same thing, right? So a lot of times you hear people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire or even the fall of the Roman Republic, and then say America is going through the same thing, right? It just oversimplifies and kind of decontextualizes these two very different times and places. Are there some aspects within both of those developments that I see as patterns and reflections of human behavior? Yeah, definitely, right? But it doesn't mean it's the same thing. And I think that's an important lesson to take away from studying the humanities too.
Definitely. And I mean, going along with this theme of similarities, right? Okay, so we've now established that no, nothing is going to happen exactly the same way. Everything's going to be different. Nothing is going to actually repeat itself just the way it was. But if we're taking certain similarities in situations, one thing that is definitely, as I see it, carried on from ancient to modern times is these places, this Mediterranean world, especially Greece in the 5th century. Definitely longer, but I'm just going to focus on the 5th century because that's my wheelhouse. Everyone was super xenophobic, super not welcoming. We know what they thought of the Persians, on these barbarians, because all they spoke was bar. If we're talking about similarities and attitudes and cultural things, then there's this definite hostility baked into the Mediterranean world of the other and the different. And if we're talking about parallels to the modern world, one thing that I was quite excited to be able to have you on for the specific purpose of asking, which is, what is it like being an Asian person, a minority in classics? Because if we're studying places that were so hostile to difference and other, what would they think of two Asian people studying them and sort of criticizing what they did wrong and sort of trying to praise what they did right, even though there's always these complicated backstories. But that's just one thing that is carried on, which is and the field itself, there's a reason it's stereotyped down to, well, it's just a study of old white people and blah blah blah, because that's all they liked.
Complicated question. So how do I respond? There was probably a time in my life where I wouldn't want to have been identified as a Korean American ancient historian or Korean American classicist, right? There was probably a time in my life where I just wanted to be known for my work, right? That the work would speak for itself. But I think as I've grown older and as I've tried to figure out who I am, it's a lifelong process, right? But like 100% Korean American, and I'm proud of that. It is such a part of who I am that I can't deny that, And so even as I'm in this kind of academic world where I am undoubtedly a minority, I'm proud of that, and I want to be in that field. And what I want to see is more diversity in my academic community, right? So I want to see more Asian people. I want to see more Black people. I want to see more brown people, like everyone. There is this ideological battle that's being waged right now in the public sphere. And unfortunately, so much of that is driven by like misinformation and misinterpretation and, the unfortunate like culture wars that people want to fight, and classics becomes this locus for a lot of those culture wars because some people think of it as the legacy or the bedrock of Western civilization, whatever that means, without criticizing and analyzing the problems within that storyline, right? That classics is a part of this elite white male world and tradition of education that has come from Europe to here. And if we can't dismantle some of it and really self-analyze and critique that legacy of studying the past, then classics is all it's going to be, this kind of elite white male vestige of the past. But we can become a field where people like you and me, with all of our differences and diversity, can come to the field and read the texts and explain things using the different lenses that we come with. That can make the field better. And that's what I'm hopeful for, right? So yeah, so for me, my person is such an essential part of the work that I do. It doesn't always come out in what I write, but the way I think about things, I must recognize that my own experiences and my background play a part in that. And I think that's something to celebrate, not to say that we need to be all the same. I would rather we be all very different. I mean, for me, there's no room for racism, right? And there's no room for all of the isms that plague our society. So transphobia, homophobia, all that. I don't want that to be in my fields, things that I do. And same goes for white supremacy, right? And again, those kinds of narratives, I think we need to purge those because they're nefarious, they're bad. And so if we can do the good work where we, again, figure out what it means to be a human, both then and now, and then become better society, that's to me the potential. And that's why the diversity and the inclusion and the accessibility are so important for classics. And it's struggling with that right now. I think it really is. It's trying to figure that out. What's the future?
And I think, because right now I think that the popular thing is we're going to set up a range of diversity and inclusion, either policies or boards or whatever. And to a lot of people that rings really hollow. And it's like, okay, well, another set of initiatives, which they don't explain. And we don't even know what the heck that'll be, other than they say it and it sounds nice. If we're thinking about like real world solutions, is that maybe teaching more classes about, women or slaves and foreigners in the ancient world, or something that throws like a tangible almost bone out to people of color? Because what I've been noticing, because I have a lot of friends who are Egyptologists, and one thing they say is because that field also is really a colonialist white sort of subject of study, at least at the academic level, it does not appeal, and there's nothing really about it as it's currently constructed that makes it seem very inviting. So I know a lot of people have said things like, well, now they choose to, if they go into Egyptology at all, they study it through the African prism. So so maybe they'll do it as a special study, or they've crammed it in with a subset of African studies, which is great, which is awesome. It's different, but that doesn't actually help people get into the current field of Egyptology. If you want to change like that one, you can't just sort of go and hide in the African Studies department and be like, okay, I'm doing Egypt. I don't know how we make that better for classics itself, because it is really hard, I think, as we've established. But beyond just promising a bunch of inclusion initiatives, I'm not obviously an educator at the university level, but I mean, if they put you in charge and they say, all right, try to get more minorities to come in, and don't just present them with this a la carte menu of, okay, white after white after white thing, and these people and powerful men, like, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, great. These are great subjects to explore. And like, sometimes the polychromy debate about sculpture for me exemplifies this. Too often we present the Greeks and the Romans just like the perfectly white sculpture of the Venus de Milo, right? Like, and that's what we give our students, right? The perfect white sculpture. Too often we present the perfect, pristine, spotless, blemishless statue of the Greeks and the Romans, right? Metaphorically speaking. Whereas in reality, it's like so messy. And as you said, right, slavery, misogyny, hatred, or defining and creating an other, these are part of the story of the Greeks and the Romans as well. And so we need to teach that as importantly. And so like a great example of this, because you're such a big fan of the 5th century in Athens, is the very development of democracy. Right? It is, on the one hand, a towering achievement, right, by the Athenians and other Greeks. It only applied to less than half of the population, and it was to the exclusion of many people. And so even though democracy was such a wonderful thing, right, in terms of governance and participation in it, it wasn't available to all. The pristine white statue version will say the Greeks invented democracy, which then eventually spread to other parts of Europe, to America, and here we are, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to go spread it on the rest of the world. That's the white marble pristine statue version. But then the multicolored one says, no, democracy, like, in fact, was a kind of failed experiment. It didn't last that long in Greece relative to this, where we are today. And it wasn't even practiced in every part of Greece, right? So it wasn't that the Greeks, all of them, embraced democracy. Only some of them did. And the version that they eventually came up with was really messy, right? And even within that, like, certain individuals, people who could speak really well, could sway the audiences to vote for things that might seem reprehensible to us, right? And Thucydides is a great text to do that, right? And again, like that text is, Thucydides provides us so many examples of the messiness of the Greeks or the Athenians or the Spartans or whoever we're talking about, right? So I think we have to present for my students now, the multicolored version of these Greeks and the Romans, right? At the same time, that multicoloredness, like, now there's some really cool things that people have done, especially in theater and in Greek drama, where we have diverse authors and writers who are bringing to classics these multiple perspectives that help us to understand more richly who these Greeks and Romans that we're so interested in were, right? So, like, I'm thinking of like scholars like Shelley Haley and Patrice Rankine and Emily Greenwood and Daniel Padilla Peralta and Rosa Andujar. Like, all these people are like bringing to classics these different perspectives that I think will make the field better and more rich and more appealing to students, especially of color, right? Of non-white backgrounds. And I think that's something that we absolutely need in the field to revitalize it. Otherwise, it's going to die in public universities, regional universities, and liberal arts colleges that are not elite. And it's only going to survive in Ivies, the public Ivies, and the elite small liberal arts colleges, which are very difficult to get to if you're a person of color too, right? So classics needs to figure out how to become much more expansive, inclusive, diverse, all of that from a younger age too. Like, we need to also do this not just at the college level, because if it's at the college level, it's perhaps even already too late. So in primary and secondary, and I think that's something where we need to do a lot more work, is like I said, right? Because I started my interest in classics in 4th grade. Can we do that again? Can we bring back some of this interest in the Mediterranean cultures in a more nuanced way? Can we bring that to primary and secondary? I hope so. That would be a great way to begin to ensure the future of the field.
I think those are all great suggestions, but also I'm about to drop a very scorching hot take of my own, which is,
drop it.
We force our kids to do more than usually 1 year of some kind of US American history. And if you're lucky, you'll get world history class.
Yeah.
Well, my take is, okay, you should be able to opt out of taking US history if you don't want it, because I was always one of those kids who was like, I don't care. I was like, I mean, I do care, but I was also like, this is not what my jam is. And I just know it's not for me. So I would have given anything in the world to opt out of that in favor of an ancient history course at the high school level.
Oh,
because
wow.
my world history class was great, but it was all like contemporary. And if I want to get to root causes of root world issues, there's no better place to start than an ancient history class. So respectfully, for all the people who I might have just pissed off by saying don't require everyone to take a US history course, here's my rationale. I'll explain it to you, which is we already like whitewash our own history. We already gloss over a bunch of slavery stuff. We gloss over so much. And with the current culture wars with, oh no, now you can't teach about Juneteenth or the, you know, whatever. You can't teach critical race theory or whatever these people are fighting about. That I'm like, this is just a ridiculous pissing match in my opinion. But we already don't like to talk about it. So I'm kind of like, respectfully, what's the point of teaching me this like super uber whitewashed, almost nationalistic history of the US when I'm like, okay, you know what? I don't need that. I'm a person of color in this country. I don't really want to sit there and listen to that. So if you provide me with an ancient history course where I can just study the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians, I personally would derive so much more knowledge and history and self-awareness out of that, because then I could really take that and then go into, okay, these are root causes. This is where these started. Let's go forward. Find the parallels.
That is a hot take. I mean, I guess the danger would be if you were to take this ancient history course that you could also get that same whitewashed version, right? And it so really matters who's teaching the class and what the curricular standards are. So I hear you on that. But my pushback would be, especially with US history and in particular civics, right? Like government. You know, we have a like increasingly clueless citizen body, easily swayed by whatever news program or pundit they hear speaking on television, right? And I don't know the answer to this, like at the primary and secondary. One thing would be to like eliminate standardized testing. Like if we could find a way to get rid of those kinds of tests and then actually like make the curricula more robust with more history and more ancient history and more civics and more literature, like to me, that has the long-term effect of creating a more well-informed citizen body. I feel you on that take, right? I don't know, like for me, like when I took US history in high school, I had a good teacher. And again, that's a relative definition, right, of what constitutes a good teacher. And I was preparing for the AP test. And so again, standardized test means we were learning history toward a particular goal that I don't think is that great. I think AP tests are really not great. To think of them as an equivalent of a college course is, I think, really, really flawed. So if we could like reimagine how we do primary and secondary without all that testing, that would be a wonderful. And I know why those tests exist, right? Standards, funding, you know, graduation rates, all of these things. I know those are part of it, right? So I'm not so naive as to say we could just get rid of them all. Yeah, if we could really reimagine education in a way that did more humanities, I think we can agree on that. That would be great. You know, but
for sure. I mean, I guess, okay, I'll backtrack a little bit and say, I'm with you 100%. I've always just railed against standardized testing because I hate it and I think it's stupid. It does not measure your actual intelligence. It's just, you know, as you said, it just measures how well you know how to take a test and deal with that. But I will say, I did actually have a quite wonderful US history teacher in high school. I loved her. I'm still friends with her today. I see her on social media. Sometimes I run into her. We have lovely conversations. I didn't hate the class. I did not hate my class, and I learned a lot about it. And I do agree that, you know, keeping our population in the dark at a time where we need to be more civically engaged, it is critically important. I just think we could reframe it in terms of, if you like create a whole class, a separate class, and call it like American government or civic engagement, right? And then you could change the curriculum to include the historical aspects of learning the history behind how our government works and why it does what it does and how to be involved and why it's important to be involved.
Mm.
So maybe instead of abolishing US history courses or making them optional, I just think we maybe should at least try to change the way they're currently taught, so that way it's not so much on, because what I feel right now is just, maybe it's because of my recent experience taking this class. Let's see, when I took it, I was a sophomore in high school, so this might have been circa 2011, 2012. It still shocks me when it's like, my history class did not teach me so much what government did, other than this is what it looks like. They teach you about, okay, well, these are our branches and this is what they do. They don't talk about why it's important. They don't talk about why we need to be engaged. They just say this is what it is, and then we're putting it in history, and this is revolutionary. And I'm like, okay, great. So maybe it's the current form is what I have a problem with, because I think we just need to really reframe that narrative. So I'll go back on the scorching hot take and say, let's not abolish U.S. history. I'm not trying to piss people off. At this point, as I see it, it is the duty of historians to really just like throw some random, sometimes great, sometimes super shitty ideas out there and just start that conversation, because I think we're here to be the drivers of this new conversation to make the world better. So if someone wants to jump down my throat and be like, oh my goodness, she's trying to cancel US history, I'm not trying to do that. I'm just throwing out like a possibly really shitty suggestion, but that will get you thinking. So
no, I love that, right? And that's what discourse should be, right? We should be able to talk about these things, right? And I would love to see more music and more art and things in the curriculum that are gone now, and unfortunately, especially in public education, like I wish more money went to public education.
I agree with you, and as someone who has worked in government, studied it, looked at it, I can only say we need massive funding changes, but that is in and of itself a whole conversation. But
Yes.
I love this point that we are getting to, which is just we need to start conversations and keep them going to turn ourselves into something better, something that we would hope is more inclusive and just all around an improvement over what's currently here. And I think that's a great point to sort of leave that on, because I want it to stew and I want people to really be thinking about this. I want to transition now to what I see as my favorite part of the podcast, which is at the end, I ask every guest to read the Percy Shelley version of Ozymandias. And then after reading it, it doesn't need to be the most erudite thing you've ever said, but just, quick takes on what is the meaning of this poem? What is it trying to tell us? What lessons can we learn from it? And, what kind of messages does it evoke for you?
Okay, so shall I read the poem then?
Yes,
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Here we go. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fled, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Wow, that's a great poem. So many thoughts are going through my head. I mean, for one, I just feel like empires rise and fall, civilizations rise and fall, great people rise and fall. And maybe when that sculpture was made, it was a symbol, physical manifestation of the greatness of this king and his empire. But now it's broken and shattered and just surrounded by grains of sand. So I think that's a lesson in humility for all of us, right? Any of the things that we do, the culture we're a part of, the civilization we're a part of, it may seem great now, but 3,000, 4,000 years from now, it may be very well like this statue. This is going to sound so strange coming from an academic, but I think one of the most important virtues we need to cultivate in academia is humility. And I try, I really try. and it's hard. But I think if more of us were humble about our abilities, the subjects that we study, then I think we again could become our better selves as individuals and as a society. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. And I have met so many people, classicists, who are very familiar with this poem. And I have met tons who this is perhaps the first time they've ever read it. Or maybe they haven't read it since they were in high school or college and they hadn't seen it in forever. Just to recap a little bit, Shelley wrote this in 1818 about a giant statue. So Ozymandias was actually Ramesses II. And Ozymandias is his Greek throne name. They had found this old statue of Ramesses, and they were bringing it back to be kept in the British Museum. And he saw it, and he was so inspired by this ginormous broken statue that they were hauling back from Egypt. And it was just the head buried in sand that they found next to these trunkless legs. And he was like, I'm going to write this beautifully poetic poem. And then he did. And now it's there for all time, and we love it. But yeah, it speaks to me, yes, humbleness, the fleeting nature of political power. It's so ephemeral. This idea that he thought he was going to be the greatest pharaoh over the greatest civilization that would last thousands of years and be the greatest ever. Clearly, that did not happen. The civilization just kind of melted into the sand in the desert and was lost to time until the little guys, the little people, the chronically underfunded archaeologists who spend their time digging because it's a service to humanity and they are just tragically not paid very well. But we dig it up and we find these things. So yeah, it's definitely this argument that you cannot do it alone, and your actions, whatever you do now, I mean, it stands almost to reason that if you will be remembered if you do nice things and you're worthy of people's remembrance, versus if you just build statues to yourself and then talk about how great you are and then everyone hates you and then they are gladly like, okay, whatever, bye. If we are considering the poem from this great stance that you hit right there on humility and just fleeting power, stature, everything. Last question that I ask every single guest, and it's my favorite question. It really is. Considering our modern society and everything that comes with it, is there a modern Ozymandias, something that we think is so great right now that it's going to last forever and be the best thing ever? Realistically, people 2,000 years from now, are they going to look back at us and say, what the hell were they thinking? That's just horrible. Like, ugh.
What is that thing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, that's a really interesting question, and probably one, whatever I answer, will get me in huge trouble. No, relatively. This is gonna sound so weird, but maybe democracy. I don't know. That's such a profound question, but maybe we'll have figured something out. Not saying that other forms of governance that we have experimented with are any better. Maybe what we think of as the best of the worst or the least worst of the best. I don't know. Like I just don't know. We might be doing something very differently 2,000 years from now with respect to governance. But
I mean, I don't think that that's crazy at all. I mean, the answers are so varied, right? I mean, people have said capitalism, just straight up capitalism. I don't think it's wild to suspect that. What if everything else kind of sucks right now. I mean, we don't really have anything that's like perfect, the silver bullet, but what if we invent something better than democracy, which I know some people may be shocked at hearing that right now, but say we do invent something that's a lot better than democracy, we could look back and be like, that democracy thing, yeah, that was like weird.
Well, I can sure say that it isn't fascism, that's for sure. That's so whatever it is that we come up with, I hope it again makes us better together and individuals. So
I hope so too. We can only hope for a better world that hopefully we can create at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you so much, though, for joining me on the podcast. It's been such a treat to be able to speak with you and just to have this great, wide-ranging conversation where we kind of drop some hot takes and reimagine things. And I'm a little sad we didn't get more into your research. I was trying, but the flow of the conversation was just so great. I couldn't cut us off. So
yeah, it was natural, and I really appreciate that you allowed it to kind of go in different directions. And yeah, I mean, from the very start, it's like we were already moving, and that's a wonderful thing, right? Because we have so much to talk about. So yeah, maybe in the future occasion we can talk about my research. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be on here. It was really fun.
It's always a fun day when I get to meet fellow classicists, not only of color, but fellow Asian classicists. It reminds me, like, we do exist. We're here. Because sometimes, it's pretty lonely coming from University of Missouri, where there may have been one African American person, but like honestly, it was like all white people and me.
And there's an Asian and an Asian American Classical Caucus for the Society for Classical Studies. So if you're not already on their email list, jump on it. Okay.
All right. Well, you've heard it here. Luckily I am on their emailing list. Yep. Because it's very important to find my other fellow Asian nerds who nerd out about this stuff. But quickly, where can people find you if they would like to contact you?
Yeah, all of my contact information is available on my departmental website. So if you just Google search Young Richard Kim UIC, I think that should come up with my profile. So yeah, love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lexie. It was a pleasure.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.